Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Gregory Feifer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. Welcome to this discussion about civil liberties under pandemics. Now, as countries around the world feel mounting pressure to reopen their economies while trying to keep the spread of COVID-19 at bay, how do they balance protecting civil liberties with public health? Even human rights groups agree our extraordinary times require governments to undertake extraordinary measures to shut borders, to enforce quarantines, and track infected people. But autocratic regimes are exploiting this moment to consolidate power, and even the governments of well-established democracies are using the pandemic to expand their powers. So, how must we try to protect our rights, and what can we learn from previous crises to help us now? I am really pleased to have former Institute fellows Carol Rose and Bryn Barnard here, Carol in Boston and Bryn in Singapore, to discuss these questions as well as their work and life under the pandemic. Carol is the executive director of the ACLU Massachusetts. A journalist and lawyer, she specializes in the First Amendment, intellectual property, and international human rights law. Her ICWA fellowship was in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Nepal. Bryn is the author and illustrator of Outbreak, Plagues That Changed History, and other books for children. His ICWA fellowship was in visual communication in Southeast Asia. He lives and teaches in Singapore. So they'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then participants can ask questions, and we'll go for about another 20 minutes or so. To ask a question, please click on the hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom box to virtually raise your hand. We'll see your requests and pick you chronologically. You'll be muted until we call on you to speak. And please introduce yourself and ask a single brief question. And you can also submit questions by writing them in the chat function. ICWA's Rebecca Picard is also in the line and will help respond. So Carol, I would like to start with you by asking just a blunt question about what most worries you about what's going on in the United States under the pandemic and what you see as the main threats to civil liberties in this country.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And I'm always delighted to do anything with the Institute because it was such an important part of shaping my life and my path as both an internationalist and a civil rights and civil liberties lawyer. So I want to thank you for that. So I think the greatest threats right now is that we fall into the trap of having false dichotomies between civil liberties and public health. Our feeling at the ACLU has always been that, and legal and public health experts agree, that voluntary compliance with public health measures is always the best way to achieve the desired outcome, because if you don't have voluntary compliance and you end up with the government crackdowns that we're going to be talking about today, and then people try to get around it and you end up with civil unrest, and that both violates public health and violates civil liberties. So the most important thing that we're doing at the ACLU is to try to help us avoid having the false trade-offs, because I think it's possible, in fact critical, that we find ways to align public health and civil liberties. And that means ensuring that people who want to comply with public health measures are able to do so. So they can do that because they have access. They don't have to choose between feeding their families or paying their rent and complying with public health requirements. So for me, I think the greatest danger we face is falling into the trap of pitting freedom and public health. In fact, I think it's possible and necessary that we try to be both safe and free.
And can I just briefly ask you to describe some of the main issues or sort of specific issues and cases the Massachusetts ACLU is focusing on right now?
Right, absolutely. So not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, because there are ACLU offices in all 50 states. We're focusing in a number of areas. So number one, we're focusing on the most emergency, which is trying to make sure that people who are held in government detention are able to not have death sentences effectively, because jails, prisons, and ICE detention centers are, of course, breeding grounds for COVID-19. And so we have filed Nationwide, I think we filed around 50 lawsuits across the country, including 3 or 4 in Massachusetts. We've managed to make sure that people who are being held pre-trial, that is, they haven't been convicted of anything, but maybe they're too poor to make bail, or they missed a drug test, for example, if they're in, and they have to go in for like a 90-day mandatory. So those people we've been able to set free. I'm going to say about 1,000 people. In terms of post-conviction, we've been thinking about people who are very elderly and very sick, that they should be eligible for compassionate release. And then in terms of ICE civil detention, we're trying to say that no one should be held on an ICE detainer. That is a civil, not a crime, but a civil charge, such as overstaying a visa, because again, there are other ways that, such as a bracelet or home confinement, that would enable them to not be exposed to a potentially deadly virus. So incarceration and sort of detention is the first category. The second is voting rights. So we're spending a lot of time, again, both here in Massachusetts and around the country, making sure that people don't have to choose between exercising their right to vote and being exposed to the virus. That's what happened in Wisconsin, for example. So we're trying to do that by working to make sure that there are many avenues to voting, both in person in ways that are safe, but also by mail and with absentee ballots across the country. The fact that the Trump administration is trying to shut down the post office right now is critical to trying to make sure that we have the ability for people to vote without having to choose between being exposed to a deadly virus and exercising their franchise. A third area that we're looking at has to do with surveillance and privacy. So that goes into things like contact tracing, the danger of having an internal passport system, a situation where, like, if you could only go to work and if you have an internal passport because you have tested for the antibody, and we can go into that during the Q&A, but there's a lot of potential, really dystopian things that can come about in the name of public health. And again, as I said earlier, I think we want to avoid having a false trade-off between liberty and public health, because I think it's possible to have both. And then I guess the other area, which is not quite essential, but is happening across the country, is in many states, not in Massachusetts, a lot of the governors are actually using the COVID crisis as a way to try to shut down access to abortion care. So we're trying to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thanks very much for that, Carol. So, Bryn, you unwittingly perhaps anticipated this moment in our social history about 15 years ago or so, with a striking painting that you made imagining people in San Francisco celebrating the end of World War I. A couple in the foreground is smooching, but it's during the Spanish flu epidemic. They're wearing face masks. And I mean, this looks very similar to photos that we see now of every day. So I wanted to ask you, what did you learn writing that book that's particularly relevant to you now?
Well, thanks for having me. I always am pleased to do anything with the Institute, because, as Carol said, it was instrumental in the evolution of my life.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.
That's not the smooching couple, but what I learned in writing and illustrating this book, doing the research for it, was how again and again government powers tend to increase during times of pandemic, and the rights of the individual tend to decrease. So the rights of the community seem to take precedence over the rights of the individual, and that's not just in the United States, but currently, but during the TB epidemic of the late 19th and 20th centuries, during the repeated cholera pandemics that swept around the world in the 19th century, and during the Spanish flu pandemic, that again and again and again, that for the safety of everyone, people's individual liberty was constrained. And that was usually a swing of the pendulum that was temporary until the pandemic receded, and then at least in the United States, individual liberties would return. Now, I'm living in Singapore now, which is has a very different situation than the U.S. It's a much smaller country, has a much different history, a much different legal system, and their response to the current pandemic has been quite different as well. And I think one of the really crucial differences here is that very early on, besides closing their borders like a lot of countries did, is that the government decided to provide wage protections from the very beginning for everybody, including people in the gig economy, including taxi drivers, including, so from not your full salary, but enough so that you could pay your rent, you could pay your utilities, and you can eat. And so the pressure to reopen that you see in the U.S. now, it just doesn't exist here for several reasons. Is that the kind of right to assembly and protest and stuff that we take as a given in the U.S. doesn't exist here, but also it's just not. There's not even that kind of agitation in social media because people feel they feel relatively safe. There's also been a very consistent message here from top to bottom. We get about every 2 to 3 weeks, the Prime Minister has given an address, followed by an address by public health officials, and they're all speaking from the same hymnal. So very consistent message. And so, so even though it's really not, it's hard to compare a country of 5 million to a country of 300 million. But the response, this would probably be more similar to Denmark or something, which has done similar things. But one thing that is similar to the U.S. is that we have a big migrant labor population here, and that has been where a big hotspot of infections has really changed the picture. From Singapore was getting all the headlines as we're doing it right, and look, isn't it wonderful? Look at the Singapore model. To now, it's looking at this issue of migrant foreign labor kept in very tight quarters and dorms, and so they're now under complete lockdown. So that's quite a change from January, when it was 1, 2, 3 a day, to about a month ago it was up to 1,600 a day cases, and now it's down to about 800 a day because of the lockdown.
And that was an unwitting oversight, or I mean, how did that happen under such otherwise stringent lockdown measures?
Yeah, I think it was really an oversight. I think epidemiologists had pointed this out, but I think initially the very first cluster that appeared here was actually in a church, a big mega church, and so the government was following the clusters one by one, and then clusters started appearing in the dorms, and it was belatedly that they realized, this is an issue, So the early thinking was, okay, well, these are all pretty young workers. Let's we'll just try and separate them in the dorms. But these are people that are living in bunk beds, often 8 to a room with shared cooking facilities. It's impossible really to quarantine, and so they've been rapidly trying to build out facilities, not at the speed that they've done in China, but basically where people that are ill can be separated from people that are well, and ideally treated just by staying at home rather than having to move this large population, well over 1 million into hospitals, which would completely crash. It would crash the medical system. So they're trying to, I'm sure you've heard the article, The Hammer and the Dance, that came out about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, that was about, suppression. That's the hammer, where you really come down hard. And then the dance afterwards is how do you mitigate? And Singapore didn't do that initially. They tried to mitigate early, and then we had this explosion in cases, and so then came down really hard to where everyone's locked down at home. We really only go out for exercise only in our local areas. Everyone's required to wear a mask. There's enforcement ambassadors all over the place that make sure that you behave as you're expected to. You're allowed to exercise, but again, only near your home. And then basically stay home until this goes away. Supposedly starting June 1st, if we get down to single digits for people outside of the dorms. So we really have, there was an article that came out last week called A Tale of Two Pandemics. And really, they're looking at local numbers of Singaporeans and permanent residents, if those numbers come down to single digits, then there'll be a very slow reopening. But if there's a spike, then they'll lock down again. Schools will reopen, that sort of thing. The worker dorms are being treated as a completely separate issue, because effectively they've been cut off from the population. And reporters can go in, talk to them. From most of the reports you get is that they're collecting their wages, money's being sent home to their families, they're getting medical care, they're being provided for, so that it's a very different situation than we're basically in the U.S. where everyone's out of a job and now what do I do?
Yeah, and there was a similarly titled article in the New Yorker recently about the different responses in Seattle and Washington State and New York in terms of listening to the medical experts. Carola, I'd like to ask you about technology, because as the pressure mounts to open, it could be a very useful tool for opening the economy by tracking infections and also for keeping track of and controlling the population in countries like China and Russia. But it's a big challenge for democracies too, of course. Contact tracing is one of the hopes to be able to partially reopen economies, but it's also an invasion of privacy. And countries all over the world are grappling with this issue. It's something the EU is discussing, trying to develop a continent-wide system. And one of the debates there is whether information about people's locations and exposure collected on smartphones would stay on their phones or be collected, which could pose a danger to privacy. Is the ACLU dealing with contact tracing and apps in this country?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in touch both with the tech companies that are developing it and with state and local and sometimes federal government actors who are talking about how to implement it. And a couple of, so a lot of people have been talking about the Google Apple app, which is a voluntary app that would automatically, using Bluetooth, would sort of alert people that you can voluntarily opt in if you've been tested positive, and then people who might have been in contact with your phone would automatically get an anonymous alert. And the anonymity of it is great. And if people are really interested, the ACLU, we've put out 2 white papers about contact tracing principles that I invite people to find at aclu.org. But the problem is sort of twofold. One is, unless you have almost universal testing, it doesn't really work, because if somebody walks by my apartment and says, and my Bluetooth gets a ping saying that your phone has been in contact with somebody else's phone that's tested positive, and I can't get a test, I'm not quite sure what to do with that information. And worse, if I then don't get sick, I might decide that this ping is useless and I'm getting pinged all the time, so I'll start to disregard it. So absent a comprehensive testing regime, it's pretty hard to have, the technology isn't going to be a silver bullet. The other thing is that it's not always, it doesn't take into account the digital divide. One of the things that we're seeing through our Data for Justice project, we've been mapping both the outbreak of the COVID-19 and then the morbidity rates of COVID-19. And, as everybody knows, the racial disparities are shocking and stark. And these can be correlated to a number of things. Density of housing, of course, lack of access to medical care. A lot of the people who are in traditionally underserved communities often are considered the essential workers who are being forced to go out onto the front lines, janitors, bus drivers, et cetera. And also then comorbidities that often are associated with poverty, notably diabetes and obesity. And so you end up with a situation with the same people who don't have access to the smartphones are the people who are sickest as a collective, as an aggregate. And so there are a lot of limitations on moving to thinking that we're going to have a technical fix in and of itself, which doesn't mean we can't use technology, and I think we should, and the ACLU are very pro-technology, but the notion that technology alone will solve it is concerning. Here in Massachusetts, our governor, Republican governor actually, Charlie Baker, has done a really great thing, I think, which is he's has hooked up with Paul Farmer over at Partners in Health, who is famous for his work in Haiti and other places. And they're doing contact tracing in a more traditional way, which is actually through the departments of public health and the neighborhood health centers, which have a greater access into affected neighborhoods. Then they're calling people, and they're calling people using the appropriate languages and finding more traditional ways to reach people, and also creating employment. They've hired a lot of contact tracers to create employment. So rather than going in the direction of automation by itself, they're not rejecting automation, but they're combining automation with this human approach, a real grassroots approach, if you would, developed by Partners in Health. And I think it's going to be a real model for the rest of the nation and the world to get voluntary compliance. Because if somebody calls you and they speak your language and they're maybe even from your community, you're a lot more likely to voluntarily comply and to self-quarantine or self-distance than if you get a ping from a Bluetooth, especially if you don't have a smartphone. So I think this combination of both technology, but then again, maybe going back to some first principles, the kinds of things we learn as fellows at the Institute of Current World Affairs, of what really works. And sometimes low tech is as important as high tech if we're going to get a comprehensive public health solution.
That's fascinating. Bryn, I want to ask you whether you can talk a little bit about how else past pandemics have changed the world, to take the phrase from the title of your book. What's been the most striking about dealing with this kind of extraordinary social phenomenon that we are going through again now?
Well, it's hard to pick because they've all had such an enormous impact. But I think that in my book, the two that I think were probably the most interesting to me, and actually was the bubonic plague of the 14th century and the cholera pandemics of the 19th century. The first, because it this is a pandemic that started in China in, I think, 1437. By the time 1431, arrived in the Crimean Peninsula about 1436. Arrived, I think it was October 1437, in Messina, Sicily, and by 1451 was 1351. Apologize there. Had spread all the way to Greenland. So it had in the course of 20 years, it went along the Silk Road and got all the way to Greenland. It's best documented in Europe. There's document. They think probably globally it probably killed at least 50 million people. Mostly in between China, the countries in between, and Europe. 25 million in Europe. That's 1/3 of the European population. And so before it arrived, you got a feudal system, with serfs serving lords, and after there weren't enough serfs, there weren't enough lords, there weren't enough priests, there weren't enough knights. So the system it didn't collapse, but it evolved into something quite different. And one of the big changes was that wealth based on land was replaced with wealth based on stuff. And you get sort of that primitive early stage of capitalism where people start collecting what's left from all of the estates that no longer have lords running them, and just there's emptiness everywhere. And so you get quite a change in the society. So you get the beginnings of capitalism. You get the change in religious ideas, because the Catholic Church wasn't really able to come up with satisfactory reasons for why it was caused. So people started looking for other reasons. You also get an increase in slavery because there's there's a labor shortage. So business owners are looking for other ways to run their businesses, and art becomes extremely pessimistic afterwards. So that had a huge impact, big ripple effects that we're living with till today. But the one that's, I think, even more interesting are the cholera pandemics of the 19th century. We're concerned now because this this pandemic has gone on for a couple of months. Those pandemics would go on sometimes for a decade. I mean, there were 6 of these cholera pandemics that swept through the world again and again and again, initially starting in Calcutta, and then from there, because of trade and because of the troop movements of the British Empire, swept around the world again and again and again. And they forced governments to start taking care of their citizens. Initially in London, and then in other European cities, and then in New York, and then eventually everywhere. Initially, before the cholera pandemics, governments it wasn't their job to supply clean drinking water or proper sewage facilities or to clean up the streets or to provide housing for the poor or public education or public parks or any of the things, or paved roads. None of that was a given that you were expected to provide. And initially there was a lot of resistance. England in 1832, when the cholera pandemics really started roaring through there, there was big separation between the classes and between the poor and the rich. And the rich took care of themselves, and the poor, they were pouring into the big cities because the Enclosure Acts had made it impossible for peasants to survive in the field. So they were, and so if you look at you want to talk about problems with, inequality. If you were poor, you were likely to die at age 20. And if you were middle class, you might make it to 30. And if you were rich, you might make it to 40. This is on average, just because of, not just of cholera, but of diphtheria and typhoid and typhus and all the other illnesses. But anyway, so it forced Parliament to start taking seriously, well, what as people are dying, normal death rates were 60 a day. They're dying at 600 a day, 700 a day, 800 a day. Just like today, they can't bury the bodies fast enough. They can't build the coffins fast enough. And it completely overwhelms the medical system of the city. So it forces lawmakers to say, what do we do differently? And that happened to be, at that time, there was a brilliant public health official. He wasn't a public health official then, but he became one, named Edwin Chadwick. And he said, rather than treating the poor the way we are, where they're in tenement apartments, crammed into rooms, no windows because there was a high tax on windows, no access to to clean water or to anything except maybe an outhouse that might serve 60 families and be cleaned out once a decade. Let's change this. Oh, the other thing, of course, is that at that time, if you were too poor to afford your own funeral, your body became the property of the state, and you were dissected. And so this was to provide medical schools with bodies. And he said, rather than treat the poor this way, why don't we make them functioning citizens? And initially, I think one of the things Parliament said was mawkish philanthropy. But then another cholera pandemic would come through, people start dying at these outrageous rates, and that starts to change attitudes. And so the reason we have a welfare state in so many countries in Europe today, and the sort of the tattered welfare state that we have here is because of that. It's not out of altruism. It's not because people feel a sense of obligation towards helping everyone. They were forced to. And you hear that term, we're all in this together. Well, that's really where people learned it. And it wasn't out of a month or 2 months or a year. It was out of almost an entire century of being hammered by cholera. And so, what we live with today, we all imagine, we can live in, Carol's in Boston, I'm in Singapore, high density cities. And you can usually live that way and not be afraid you're gonna die. Because we have well intact medical systems, sanitation, clean water, all of that was governments were forced to provide. And that's really what I got out of that, is that we don't change our behavior easily, and we don't change it necessarily because we want to, but we're forced to, and we are the beneficiaries of those people who learn those really hard lessons. And so I imagine the people that come after us come after us are going to benefit from the really hard lessons we're learning right now.
That's really fascinating. I want to come back to that with a follow-up question, but now I'd like to open it up to the participants. And I have to apologize because the way we have it set up, I can't see hands raised, and I'm going to ask Rebecca. Rebecca, can you see hands raised, or do we only have the chat function set up?
We should be able to have hands raised, but I don't see any hands raised at the moment. We did have one question though through chat.
Great. Okay, so we'll read that question from Peggy Knudsen, who asks, who says that she'd be interested in hearing a little bit about how Singaporeans view how the U.S. is handling COVID.
With curiosity and consternation, I think. They're surprised. I think Singapore is and I can only speak for here. I have friends in Malaysia too that I'm in frequent contact with, and in general, people are really shocked at what appears to be from over here the disorganization of the response and the wide variety of the response. Because these are both countries, both Malaysia and Singapore, where the response is coming from the top, and you don't have individual states or governors with that kind of power that they have in the U.S., where you can shut down one state and not another. That people are it's much more, the response is much more unified. But Singaporeans, they kind of shake their heads. They kind of can't believe what they're seeing in the news, because the Centers for Disease Control has been traditionally the place that everybody turns to for the premier infectious disease advice, the best pandemic experts in the world. Where the U.S. has always been at the forefront in the past, and now countries here are realizing that they can't rely on the U.S. for that kind of advice, and they have to look internally. So when we talk about the CDC in Singapore, it's the CDC of Singapore. It's our own Centers for Disease Control here, not the U.S.'s, which was that was when I was first hearing it. I was saying, you're not talking about your CDC. So that's been I think a real surprise for and it's been, it's being played out in real time on very public display. Social media has really changed the way people perceive all kinds of news, and so the kind of filtering that you might have gotten in a past pandemic isn't happening now. I just also wanted to point out, by the way, is that we just like the app that you talked about, Carol, we have one here. It's called Trace Together, and it has a little happy face, and it's Bluetooth, and it's also voluntary. I think about 500,000 Singaporeans have signed up for it, but because it's 500,000 out of 5 million, it has the same limitations that you talked about there. And we don't have universal testing yet, although there's talk now about testing every single migrant worker, and then maybe moving on to Singaporean residents from there. But it has the same limitations. One of the things that has happened here is that a lot of that person-to-person outreach that you've talked about, going into knocking on doors, people's apartments, going into nursing homes, not into them because of all the problems, but of contact. But there's a lot of volunteerism that's showing up here that I think is changing the relationship of Singaporeans to one another. One of the things that Singapore gets accused of is something called kiasu, which is me first. That there's a lot of by other Southeast Asians, that there's the feeling that Singaporeans just look out for themselves, and now Singaporeans, you're seeing, I think, more and more out of this. That's one of the positive things that can come out of a pandemic, that people can look after each other. You can, depending on the leadership, you can get them helping one another, or you can get them going after one another and being torn apart.
So we have another question actually for you, Bryn, and that is, what kind of questions or concerns do your international students have right now?
Well, oh, sorry.
Well, and I would pose a similar question myself to Carol. I imagine that the ACLU is approached, every day by ordinary citizens with concerns. What kinds of what are the patterns, if they are about just the concerns of so-called average people? But Bryn,
Bryn,
let's start with you.
Yeah, Bryn, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I teach at a school with about 3,000 students on 2 campuses, K through 12. So I teach personally. I have about 120 students spread out, across five classes. I also have an advisory that they're the ones I know the best because I deal with them, every day. I meet them in the morning before they go off to their classes. We're now in our 8th week of virtual teaching, and I think the students and the teachers are all finding that it's an extremely intense experience teaching this way. I'm actually getting really great results out of the students, I think because of all the attention they're getting from me being there, but it's exhausting for everyone involved. And so they're exhausted. A lot of my students live in dorms. They were here when Singapore closed its borders and their parents are in Korea or in China or in other countries. We have students who are students here and they got locked out of the country. And so we have a student, for example, in Finland, who is still trying to be a student here despite the time difference. So he's getting up at 3 in the morning and trying to participate in classes. And we have all sorts of families that have been split up by this. So we have a lot of isolation, a lot of students with getting none of the, you got to get up and do your homework, got to get to bed on time, and they're having to become, and some of these are like 7th graders, 6th graders. They're quite young. There's a guardian somewhere in Singapore for them, but then because of the lockdown, the guardians really can't come see them. So there's a lot of depression the students are suffering, a lot of anxiety, a lot of that would normally be part of their life. I don't actually sense a lot of fear about the virus itself, just because of all the reassuring messages that they're getting, and because for the most part they're just staying in their dorms and not going out. If they're living with their parents, they're not being allowed out. One of the problems is lack of exercise, I think. But that's the main thing, I think, is isolation. Is that they're used to. They say it's great because I don't have all the distractions of having all my friends around, but it's horrible because I don't have all the distractions of my friends around. So that's I think the way they're experiencing it. From the teacher's point of view, we talk about it that we all are amazed at just what a draining, intense experience it is to teach this way.
Thanks, Bryn. Carol?
Yeah, so in terms of higher education, because of course Boston is the center of higher education in Massachusetts more generally, there's a real crisis in higher education because there's an anticipation that up to 30%, up to a third of the universities, private universities and colleges are going to go bankrupt because they so rely on having international students. And the combination of the anti-immigrant policies and rhetoric of this administration combined with the ban on travel now because of the virus means that really incredible, important income for the universities and colleges is going to go away. And for the state universities and colleges, scholarships are going to go away because the international students subsidize the in-state tuition. And so there's really going to be a crisis in higher education that is very much in the news in Massachusetts, and I think should be of concern to all of us who care about having an educated democracy and citizenry. At the middle school and high school level, there's a big crisis in terms of the digital divide. So in Boston, they gave laptops to all of the students. It was really amazing, along with, by the way, 2 meals a day are being made available to all the students in Boston. The Boston high school population is, I'm going to say 2/3 free lunch program. So it's a poor urban environment. The problem is, and the ACLU of Massachusetts, we've been doing our Data for Justice program, part of our Technology for Liberty program, just did a map that we released yesterday showing internet and broadband deserts across the state and across the country. Actually, if you're interested, you can find it at aclum.org and actually put in your own community and find out what kind of broadband and digital deserts you have. So you may have a laptop, but if you don't have a Wi-Fi connection or you don't have a broadband connection, it doesn't do you any good, and you can't actually participate in the important virtual schooling. So depending on how that plays out for the fall, there's going to be a big question about whether we're going to be able, how do we provide public education if we don't first provide access to the broadband and the technology to be able to access computers. So that's one of the really big opportunities, as Bryn put it, but also challenges that we have as we look to what are we going to do? What are we going to learn from this crisis that we can take forward and begin to address a lot of these inequities and particularly racial disparities that we have in our societies, and particularly in the urban centers. Other issues that are coming up that we're hearing a lot about, homelessness and housing questions. So if people are coming out of incarceration, where do they go? What happens if you're in if one person in your family gets sick and there's 5 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment and one person is sick? Is there a place for them to go? So creating opportunities and places for people to go. So food deserts are a big problem. Shelter is a big problem. So here in Massachusetts, because we're very much still, the curve has flattened but not gone down yet. So we're still having a lot of deaths every day and a lot more infections every day. Issues around housing, food access, and those things are still very much on the front lines. And I'm really lucky. I'm sitting on the mayor's task force on healthcare and equity, so I'm hearing about it twice a week. There's a meeting, and I'm being able to watch it really closely. And I have to say, I'm incredibly impressed by the direct service providers and all they're doing. But the challenges are great, and the resources are limited, because the federal government in particular is punishing states that aren't perceived to be pro-Trump states. So they don't get as much federal funding as some of the other states do. The other thing that we're now just beginning, so there's sort of the in the crisis stuff, and then there's the going into after the crisis falls, and what does it mean in terms of reopening the economy? And there's a lot of concern in other states, particularly that if you're forced to go back to work. So for example, in Georgia, there have been a couple of lawsuits about people saying you can't get unemployment. You're allowed to go back to work. You have to go back to work. And if you fail to go back to work, you don't get unemployment. So people are being forced to go back to often low-wage jobs that may pay less than unemployment, by the way, and risk their lives because they can't get unemployment anymore. So this becomes a problem of forcing people into the workforce in ways that may endanger their lives, particularly if they have pre-existing medical vulnerabilities. So I think that's going to become a growing issue. And then the last thing that we're hearing a lot about, and you may be hearing a lot about, are the rights to association, religious right to go to church, all those kinds of things. And I would just say that what the courts do in these circumstances is the executive branches, whether it's the federal or the state level, have the power during a public health emergency or other kinds of national emergencies to put in reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So for example, in Massachusetts, there can't be gatherings of more than 10 people. That has to be applied to churches as well as political demonstrations. The question then becomes, and what the U.S. Attorney General, Bill Barr, is trying to push us to say, but for churches, there's special protections, and they can have 50 people or 500 people because they're churches, and therefore the reasonable time, place, manner restrictions that the courts typically put when there's a free speech versus public emergency shouldn't apply, and churches should be able to do pretty much whatever they want. The danger, I think, and we'll see how the courts rule, there was just a lawsuit filed yesterday here in Massachusetts about it by some churches. And I think that the courts are going to have to weigh whether or not the government interest is narrowly tailored and whether it's extreme. And that could change over time as the statistics on the pandemic go down. Maybe the government interest in restricting associational rights will go down as well. So it's a moving target, and it's going to be really interesting to watch this in the courts and to see how it plays out.
So we have a question from Hua Dong saying, first of all, thank you for the brilliant insights from the panelists. And can you comment on the racial discrimination due to COVID in both the US and Singapore and offer some advice for the public? I'm not sure whether this means the, well, surely it means human social discrimination rather than the how the virus is affecting various parts of society.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we're seeing in the U.S. is a rise in anti-Asian forms of discrimination and anti-immigrant in general discrimination. So we're doing a lot here in Massachusetts with the Chinese Progressive Association and also with the Asian American Lawyers Association to try to track and monitor incidents of anti-Asian animus and racialized incidents, as well as anti-immigrant incidents. And our state attorney general, Maura Healey, has been great on this. And so, but the sad news is we're really seeing an uptick in this, and a lot of it is being fueled by the comments coming out of the White House. And so I think there's always a temptation to blame somebody else or to otherize when there's a public health crisis. And I think that we have to be incredibly vigilant and responsive to those concerns and public education and speaking out against it and standing shoulder to shoulder across the Latinx community, the Black community, the Asian American community. Standing together in solidarity becomes tremendously important at these moments.
And Bryn, in Singapore, I mean, you touched on migrant workers.
Sure. Well, Singapore it's a multiracial country. It's primarily Chinese with Malay and Malay and Indian smaller populations. It reflects the history that during the British colonial period when they brought in these populations to do different kinds of work. Initially, when Singapore split from Malaysia, it remained that way. But for various different reasons I won't go into now, Singapore started to bring in more and more laborers, mostly from Bangladesh, some from Myanmar, from Vietnam and the Philippines, to do the work that increasingly Singaporeans didn't want to do. So these tend to be the lower wage jobs, the construction jobs, the often working in almost all the retail positions. It's widespread in the shipping industry, and Singaporeans have realized just how dependent they are on them because now they're not there. And so, for example, you go into our local grocery store, and it used to be that all the checkers were from Malaysia. 300,000 Malaysians used to come across the border every day to work in the service industry here, and then go home at night and back and forth and back and forth. So they were given a choice when the border was closed to either stay here in accommodation at their employers, that their employer would cover for them, or go back to Malaysia and, depending on the employer, either lose their job or be furloughed until this changed. For the workers that are in the dorms, until this happened, the discrimination was it was quite visual in that you would. I take a subway and the bus to school every day, and so I would walk out of my apartment, get into a bus, and you look down from the bus, and you would see pickup trucks with full of workers and sacks of cement and the other materials that are being carried around. And on the back of the pickup, it would say, how many passengers, 20, 40, 12, however many they could fit. So that's how they were ferried around. So there was this real, and then Singapore has some of the most expensive automobiles in the world because in addition to paying what you would pay for the automobile, you pay up to $60,000 on tax. So these very expensive automobiles next to these people being ferried around in trucks, you couldn't miss the difference in status. So when they started getting sick, Singapore was starting to be compared sort of unfavorably or being compared to the Gulf states. Before I worked in Singapore, I worked in Kuwait, so I had a lot of familiarity with the immigrant population there, treated much worse than here. And I think that's the last place that Singapore would like to be compared to. For example, when they started realizing, their oil revenues are way down. That's what they're completely dependent on. And a Kuwaiti actress suggested that all the immigrants should just be sent out into the desert. He says, if we can't send them home, just send them out there. Well, so Singapore's in these briefings that the Prime Minister has given, has repeatedly expressed, again and again and again, Singapore's gratitude to these workers. He says, you have built Singapore. You've built our, the skyscrapers and our hospitals and our roads. Thank you. We're going to take care of you. It's been a big public relations push to make sure that everyone, not just the workers, but everyone else is aware that they're being taken care of. Because I think Singapore is thinking not just of now, but what happens after now. And it's really dependent on its international reputation for trade, for people wanting to live here, for other workers wanting to work here. So they're not just thinking about today, but what comes next. And so it's been a kind of the opposite of the U.S. PR campaign about migrants that you're getting here.
Yeah, and if only our federal government would think about the future a little bit more seriously. So we have a question from Will Noland that I'll read. Everyone from Google to Wikipedia appears to be imposing subtle as well as blatant controls on scientific truth, as well as divergent political expression, let alone dealing with foreign misinformation efforts. In addition to the important areas of ACLU focus that Carol has already mentioned, how do you see the increasing intrusion of internet providers and search engines on freedom of expression, both for scientific debate as well as public policy?
It's a huge issue, Will. So in addition to my work at the ACLU, I'm on the board of a group called the Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which brings together the AI scientists from the top 7 tech companies as well as internationally to really try to explore the intrusions and the dangers that automation and machine learning in particular, as well as the internet more generally, can impose on our freedoms. And I think that things like synthetic media or fake media, where people are made to appear that they're speaking when it's actually they're not, are big ones. I think that fake news is a big one. I think that we did a recent survey. It was pretty interesting on who do people trust when they are talking about some of these issues. And, scientists from MIT ranked the highest. And the lowest actually was people from the high-tech companies. So interestingly, we've seen a drop in public faith and public trust in the tech companies over the last, I'd say, 3 to 5 years in particular, to now where people really don't trust them. I think one of the dangers we have is, despite Google's do no evil mantra, I don't think anybody believes that anymore. And so while the government, there may be distrust and legit distrust of the government, at least the government is subject to things like public records laws and transparency and regulation. The companies are not. So when the companies own your data or the information that you provide to them, even voluntarily or not, they own it and you don't have a right to it. Now in Europe, you do have a right to ownership of your data. And so if we think about privacy as the ability to control the information about yourself, that would be not the system of privacy we have in the United States. And so one of the things that we're working on even before the pandemic, but after, is to change the laws around who controls the data about yourself, so that if you give data, for example, because you want to be participating in pandemic tracking, there should be a rule that neither a company nor the government can use that data to track you for any other reason other than the reason that you gave permission for them to use. And they would have to go back and seek your permission or just not do it at all. And so challenging the control of the information about yourself is a big area. And then the other is this synthetic media question about fake news that's coming out, and how do we regulate the fake news? And there's a huge amount of work being done by people in the media industry, the Knight Center for the First Amendment, among others, who are really trying to figure out ways to put up flags when there's fake media, I think there's a very interesting ethical question for journalists about whether they should be giving as much airtime as they do to leaders who put out fake news, or whether we should just ignore it. They've come around a little bit to say now, the president says Clorox will cure your pandemic. That's not true. So that's great. We've had that breakthrough where now the media says that's not true. But the question is whether it should be reported at all. And I think that's hard because as a former journalist myself, there's a question about what our obligation is. And I'd love to hear from Greg actually on that question, as well as from Bryn.
I would just very quickly say that I agree with you. I think it should not be broadcast. And in fact, before the pandemic, I think misinformation shouldn't be broadcast. There's a lot of hand-wringing that the White House has given sort of historically few news conferences, public briefings since the invention of broadcast media. And forgive me, but I actually think that's a good thing.
Bryn, thoughts about it too? I'm curious.
Yeah, sure. Singapore is actually, before the pandemic, was in the news because of its it's called a fake news. It's known as the fake news law. That's not the official term for it, but essentially the parliament here passed a law which said that if any minister of the Singapore government believes that something that's been said online is not true and is detrimental to either the security of Singapore or or discriminatory to Singaporeans, they can demand it be taken down. And there was a lot of concern about this law, particularly in academia, because that if you wrote an academic paper and a minister says, well, I don't really like what you said, then they can demand that the paper be go offline. And this doesn't just apply to Singapore. This applies to the world. So if there's something is said anywhere in the world that ends up on a Singaporean platform and it's deemed to be, from the perspective of this law, fake news, the Singaporean government can demand it be taken down. There are legal penalties. There's financial penalties. There's it's quite a severe law. And as it was being developed, it came in for intense scrutiny, a lot of criticism. But Greg, you just said you think it's a good thing. Well, this is now the power that the Singaporean government has put into its hands, is to make sure that, from its perspective, that fake news doesn't get broadcast. But one person's fake news is another person's information. And so, the question I guess you'd ask is, who decides whether it's fake or not? And that's the question that's here. This is in Singapore, it's the Singaporean government that makes that determination.
Right, which from a civil liberties perspective is really scary. I'm just going to put out there from the ACLU point of view. And so how we, especially, and then the other question is on the algorithms. When the algorithms say, there's Carol Rose, she seems to always be watching civil liberties things. We'll send her lots of MSNBC links, but no Fox News links. So then I end up going into my silo and not being exposed to the marketplace of ideas. And so I think there's also a very interesting challenge as we think about the automation of the news delivery devices. And so there are a lot of people talking about this. I think it's a very interesting and important conversation, but I have yet to see someone come up with a solution that seems to balance between the censorship model that exists in Singapore and this sort of free-for-all that right now we're suffering from in this country. So if you all have thoughts, please send them my way, because I'm trying to figure it out too.
So we are coming up in an hour. There's one more question about the U.S. Presidential election coming up in November. Do either of you, both of you, have another 5 minutes or so, or are you out of time?
Go ahead,
sure,
Bryn.
I've got 5. So what's the
question's a long one. I won't read the whole question, but essentially it's raising the point that this country is constitutionally mandated to hold an election in November, but there have been sounds from the White House, from the Republican Party questioning this, threats to the USPS post mail system, and the question is essentially, how can we ensure that we have an election that is as free and fair as possible?
Well, I'll speak. The ACLU this is one of our, if not maybe the top priority nationwide that we're working on. So I think that saving the post office is important. And the good news is the post office is actually very popular. So I think it's going to be hard to take it down. But when you get those emails asking you to sign that petition, please do. It matters. I think that the ability to create multiple avenues for voting, that means not fewer voting centers, but more voting centers, so you can have social distancing. I think having absentee ballots, I think same-day voter registration, all of these different techniques of ensuring the franchise are tremendously important. And voter fraud is actually tiny. I mean, really almost de minimis in this country, but lack of access to the poll is huge. And I think it's going to be really important that all of us, voting often is done at the state or local level. There's a lot of regulations. So wherever you are, if you're in the US, reaching out to your Secretary of State, finding out what's happening in your state to make sure that people have the right to exercise their franchise. There's nothing more fundamental and frankly more patriotic than ensuring that people have the right to vote. And I think that it's going to be incredibly important this November that people are able to vote and able to exercise their franchise. And I hold my breath because I'm not completely convinced that we already know that this administration actually manipulated the 2016 election. That's a fact, and that's been proven. That actually isn't in dispute. Whether it was a crime or not is in dispute, but there's no dispute. And already Robert Mueller testified that it's happening again in this election. So I am concerned that we may not have a free and fair election in America. I think it would be a turning point historically if that happens. But in the meantime, the ACLU, and I hope all of you and all of us are doing everything we can to make sure that not only we, but all of our neighbors and the other citizens of this country have the right or have the ability to exercise their right to vote this November.
Thanks so much for that, Carol. Bryn, you have something to add?
Yes, just that one of the possible positives that come out of this would be the chaos of the disparate access to voting that we have now. Perhaps that could be a change. One of the things that concerns me, of course, epidemiologically, was that the people that are looking at this, who are suggesting that there could be a second wave hitting the U.S. just about at election time, where you're having lockdowns and that sort of thing. It's impossible to know whether that's really going to happen. If you look at the closest parallel we have is the 1918 flu, and that was relatively mild, much milder than what we're seeing now with COVID-19 when it initially arrived, and then it died down in the spring and summer, and then came back much more lethal in the fall. Now, people have said, well, they're thinking that the summer months are going to calm coronavirus down. I live in Singapore where it's hot and humid, and that has had no impact. We're getting just this. I think that probably is not going to happen. But viruses mutate. The way they interact with the population. If things start opening up as early and and with the kinds of interaction with people that we're talking about in the U.S., we could have a much bigger problem than we have now. And as has been suggested over the past couple of weeks, this could become an endemic disease, not just something that came and went like SARS, or didn't come like Ebola, but something that we just have to live with. And that could really have a change on everything. Like I said earlier, that the Black Death got rid of feudalism and brought in capitalism. It's possible that this will completely change our economic system.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. The idea that pandemics function as catalysts to really radically alter how we live has been fascinating. Carol, it's been terrific hearing about what you're doing and what the challenges are on the ground. I'd like to end just by asking you very briefly in a couple sentences or more, because we've been talking about challenges and threats to democracy, civil liberties on both sides of the Atlantic around the world. But can you just say in a sentence or two whether you think that the United States, other democracies will come out of this pandemic with stronger institutions? How optimistic are you that we'll come out sort of with a net gain rather than a net loss?
Bryn, why don't you go first?
Okay, I'll let you have the last word. If you look at historically, it goes both ways. If what the Black Death tore Europe apart. You had some of the most famous and horrific persecution of the Jews. Basically the depopulation of Central Europe, of the Jewish populations fleeing to Poland because the King of Poland invited them there. Leaving. It was awful, and it was kind of an every person for themselves kind of scenario. If you want to read about that, read Boccaccio's Decameron, and that gives you kind of a window into that. But like I pointed out with cholera. It started out that way, and then it changed, and you started getting, I wouldn't say class solidarity, but people realizing that they all needed to help one another, not for altruistic reasons, but for survival. And so we could come. Depending on the leadership and depending on the reaction of individuals, it could go either way. And that's, I'm not a prognosticator. I look more at the past than at the future. But Carol, I'll leave.
I would just say,
in your
citing Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the heart, but of the spirit, I think it is. I would just say that I'm a big believer in agency. I think the future depends on how we respond to the present. I think each of us has a role to play in this. I don't think we can look, clearly we can't look to the central government in the US to step up at this moment. But there are a lot of people who are doing a lot of good things. A lot of governors are really stepping up. A lot of mayors are really stepping up. And a lot of public health workers and teachers and artists and lawyers, and all of us are stepping up and taking charge and not sitting around and waiting for somebody else to solve the problem. Each of us has a role to play in how we respond to this. And there are a lot of good things. I've already started doing visioning conversations with my staff and my supporters about, what are the good things? Maybe we need to have less unnecessary travel, but still travel for learning like the Institute does. Maybe we need to be thinking about these racial disparities in healthcare and equities at a broader scale and not just doing it in response to a pandemic. There are so many things that we can improve voting rights and access to the ballot, which these are issues that were here before. This has merely lit a flame to poured gasoline on the flames that were already there in our society. So I'm actually hopeful because I think this will break us out of our inaction, break us out of our torpor. And if we all together can pull together and realize that we have a lot of other pandemics. We have pandemics of poverty. We have pandemics of environmental injustice and climate change. We have pandemics of substance use disorder in this country. We cannot arrest our way out of those, but we can get out of them if we pull together, because saving somebody else's life ultimately saves our lives too. And if we could change that and bring maybe a public health collaborative approach to many of our social ills, I'm actually optimistic that this might be a turning point where we build a better world. And we don't go back to the pre-COVID era, but we actually go toward and forward towards something that's actually much better, much more fair and equitable. And as I said before, that we can be both safe and free.
Carol and Bryn, on that note, thank you very much for taking part. Thanks to our audience for joining. We will post video of this discussion online. In the meantime, I hope you all please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.